We are closing the books on the month of July here on the Paperback Warrior podcast.
Welcome to the 54th episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. My name is Eric, and we're thrilled to have you with us today. Paperback Warrior is the internet's finest resource for reviews and discussion about vintage paperbacks from the 20th century, with a focus on hard-boiled crime, men's adventure, western, and spy fiction. Our blog's at paperbackwarrior.com, featuring daily reviews, and we have an active and growing community on Facebook where you can join the conversation. Let me introduce my partner, Tom, who's going to tell us about what's happening on today's show.
Hello, everybody. Today, Eric's going to be hosting a feature on author Philip Race, whose real name was Elmer Parsons. Now, you're going to learn all about him, but his life was a turbulent one that mirrors many of the shady characters he wrote about in his crime-noir paperbacks. I'm going to review a Fawcett Gold Medal paperback called Killer in White by Ted Thomey, or maybe it's Tommy, we'll learn that, from 1956. And Eric's going to review an Elmer Parsons novel, a Western, called The Easy Gun. But first, Eric, I think you had some new acquisitions you wanted to talk about, right?
That's right, man. I have been doing some shopping. I've been spending my money, and I really enjoyed the Motor City Blue novel by Lauren D. Estelman. And I went out and got the next two entries in that series. Those were called Angel Eyes and The Midnight Man. And I bought these at Chamberlain's Book Mine, the big one up in Jacksonville. But if you've been telling me about a unique Robert B. Parker novel, the last couple times I talked with you, you said, I need to read this book. So many listeners know that Parker is the author behind the Spencer empire of books. These spawned the ABC television show Spencer for Hire, and also the recent Netflix movie Spencer Confidential, which I hear is awful. But the Robert Parker book I bought is called Wilderness, and I found a paperback copy at Chamberlain's. What do I need to know about this book without spoiling it for me or our listeners at home?
All right, first of all, you're in for a treat. The book's great. Wilderness by Robert B. Parker is a standalone novel. It was originally released in October 1979. Because of the popularity of the Spencer series, Wilderness has been reprinted 1 million times, and it remains in print as a paperback or an $8 ebook. Now, the plot's pretty simple. A writer witnesses a murder committed by a well-known gangster. And this is a great piece of evidence for the cops who have never been able to get evidence against this mobster. So the mobster threatens the family of our protagonist, and the writer knows that it's never going to end. So the writer ends up teaming with a war veteran buddy, and the story evolves into kind of a kill or be killed manhunt through the wilderness. I read the book in 1986 when I was 16 years old, and I loved it. A friend of mine literally handed it to me and said, "You've got to read this book." And I trusted the guy, and I read it, and he was right. I was way smarter and more discerning then, back when I was 16, so I'm sure it's going to hold up for you today, Eric. Will you let us know what you think on the show?
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to read it, and I'm going to review it probably in about 3 or 4 episodes.
Well, Eric, I finally took my show on the road.
Really?
My first time actually leaving the state of Florida since the pandemic began. I went up to Blue Ridge, Georgia. Ever heard of it?
No.
It's a town in the Appalachian Mountains on the Tennessee border. Actually, my family and I went whitewater rafting up there. And it's a really quaint tourist town in Georgia. And my hunch from kind of driving around a little bit, the vibe I get, it's about 100 miles north of Atlanta. And it might be like a vacation getaway for like people in Atlanta would have like a cottage to go up there for the weekend. Right. It had that feel. It's also along the Appalachian Trail. And we went whitewater rafting along the Ocoee River in Tennessee. And there's a lake there with fancy vacation homes for the Atlanta's rich to get away with from life in Atlanta and stuff. In a pretty sleepy downtown Main Street with homemade fudge shops, a very good comic book store, and like Mountain Man knickknacks. On the highway, there are not one, Eric, but 2 Bigfoot museums. And they
really?
Both museums promise to present the visitors with irrefutable proof that Sasquatch is real.
Really?
Yeah, we parked there, but I didn't actually go in. I dumped my car and then hopped in with my brother.
Did they have any Bigfoot jerky to sell?
I'm not sure. I suspected it was a pretty expensive thing to go in there, but there was also a very nice used bookstore, and that's kind of why I'm bringing it up here. It was small but well curated. The name of the bookstore is Equinn Bookstore. in Blue Ridge, Georgia. And if you're in Blue Ridge, Georgia, it's definitely worth stopping by. Again, small, well-curated. When you walk in, there's a spinner rack with vintage science fiction and mystery shelves with lots and lots of bagged vintage paperbacks interspersed with the hardcovers.
Yep.
Their selection, they had a lot of Black Lizard crime reprints from the 1980s. You see those around, right?
Yep.
They had Jim Thompson, Charles Willeford, David Goodis. There were a ton of Perry Mason paperbacks by Earl Stanley Gardner and some of the Cool and Lamb paperbacks by his pseudonym A.A. Fair. One thing that was really weird is they had some Ellery Queen books, but they had a bunch of Ellery Queen mystery magazines from like the 1970s, like kind of unremarkable, maybe even the 1980s, but like bagged up as if they were something of real value.
Yeah. It's amazing what people find in these treasures.
Yeah, I mean, I see those at like yard sales.
Yeah.
They had the Alfred Hitchcock anthologies, a bunch of John Creasy, there's some Carter Brown, some Mike Shame. The bagged books, though, and that was nearly all of them, were priced way too high, like $8 for a vintage paperback. I saw several as high as $20. And these were books that you see everywhere.
Like John McDonald kind of stuff?
Well, like Perry Mason.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's stuff you see a lot of. And again, he had these Ellery Queen mystery magazines priced at like $10 a digest, but just bagged up. So it was really weird. There's also this very robust Western section with lots of paperbacks. I found an ace copy of Clifton Adams' book Shorty from 1966, but the guy wanted $14 for it. There's also an Amos Flagg book. It was Amos Flagg Has His Day by Clay Randall from 1963 that looked good. $21.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
It's a paperback. I mean, they're in decent condition, but it's insane. He did have a bunch of Detective Book Club triples that he said he'd sell me for $5 a book. It was a good deal, but I don't really like those because they were censored, and they're just sort of cumbersome.
Yeah.
So I picked up 3 books without bags, and I ended up buying them, but I'll tell you. First one here is by, you ever heard of Andre Norton?
Yes, I have. I've got one of his books.
He's a science fiction author, or maybe science fiction and fantasy. And so I had no idea that he had written anything other than that. This appears to be a Civil War novel by him. I just threw it at you, called Ride, Proud Rebel. Looks good.
Yeah.
And so the next one I got here is a British book called Smile and Be a Villain by Hamilton Jobson. You ever heard of this guy?
No, I have not. Nor have I ever heard of Brid Books.
Yeah, me neither. It's the series is a British police procedural. It's starring character Matt Anders. This is the first book in the series. Pretty highly regarded, but I think they're more straight up mysteries. And then I got this here, Girl Running by Adam Knight. Beautiful cover on it. It's actually Adam Knight is Lawrence Larriere. I reviewed one of his books about a guy. I think it was called like I Can't Stop Running or something like that.
Yes.
About a guy who was hired a hitman to kill himself, and then he changes his mind and he can't get the hitman off him. Anyway, but I guess he wrote 8 books in with the PI starring Steve Conacher. And this is the 7th book in the series. There are 8 books in the series between 1951 and 1959. They're basically like Mike Hammer pastiches, very similar to Mike Hammer, but it looks good.
Beautiful cover.
Yeah, I was happy to get it. But so good bookstore, high prices. But the most annoying, all 3 of those books were unpriced, and I brought them up there, and they were unbagged on the shelf. And so I brought them up there and said, "Hey man, I'd like these 3. How much are they?" And he goes, "Let me see." And he hops on the computer, and he spends an inordinate amount of time clearly surfing the internet. He's not looking up his own database.
Right.
And I've had this happen before. Has this ever happened to you in a bookstore?
Yeah, it has.
Yeah. I think I know what they're doing, because there was a bookstore in Tallahassee that burned down. Thank God, I hated them. And that I was nowhere near when it happened, so I got an alibi. But what they would do is they would hop on Amazon and take a look at the used books on Amazon to see how much this book is quote-unquote worth if one were to buy it used on Amazon, and that's the price he just spits forward. So I think this Equinn guy may have been doing the same thing, where he was literally going on either eBay or Amazon or maybe Abe Books to find out what is this book going for right now. And so those books that I threw at you, and I probably shouldn't have bought them, but I get like Stockholm Syndrome when I travel sometimes, cost me $12, $10, and $8 respectively. So I way overpaid for these 3 books.
I'm shocked that you paid that much.
I know. It happens to me when I drive like 8 hours to go to a bookstore, and I get there and I feel like just kind of obligated to get something. And I also want content for the show because they're getting bored about me going to the local bookstore here and finding like a Carter Brown book. So I overpaid for the books. I have to say that the proprietor who I talked to, and I was telling him about Paperback Warrior and all of that, Nicest guy in the world.
Oh,
really
good.
nice. And like he's like, oh hey, and he kept saying, it was funny. He's like, oh, you like pulp, huh? You like pulp? And I was like, yeah, I guess I like pulp. I don't really generally call it pulp, but I'm not one of these pedantic guys who really cares. Like, it's all pulp fiction, I guess. He's like, I got boxes and boxes of pulp. And I go, you got to hear the store?
Yeah, where is it?
And he's like, no, I'm going through it all, and I'm kind of putting them on the shelves a little bit at a time.
They're always going through it all.
But here's the thing. Like, even if he had the boxes back there, if he's going to charge me $12 a book, I don't even want to see him.
Yeah.
I don't even want to see him. And nice guy. He like bags them up for me in like those bags that they're in now. Could not have been nicer. And I suspect that he's in this tourist town with a high rent district. He's still in business, which says a lot because most used bookstores aren't.
Yeah.
So he must be doing something right. But I was looking at the prices and just experiencing severe sticker shock.
Did he sell new books as well?
No.
It was just
It was a used bookstore, but it was very well curated. It was like, you could tell he wasn't like there was no like James Patterson or anything like that. These were all pretty much vintage books.
Okay.
And, he had like maritime books and books about Appalachia and stuff like that also. It wasn't all just like fun fiction.
Yeah.
But, it was a nice bookstore. If anyone is in Blue Ridge, Georgia, they should definitely go, but just bring a lot of money.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, that was my trip. Again, the bookstore was called Equinn Bookstore in Blue Ridge, Georgia, and check it out.
Awesome.
Before we launch into your feature, it's been a while since we did shout-outs to superfans who put some cash in the tip jar to keep this podcast running. You see, we don't have a paywall here at Paperback Warrior, and all of our content, both past and present, is available to you, the listener, for free. We also don't take advertising, so you don't get to hear us selling you mattresses or dietary supplements that are going to make you grow 3 inches. Instead, we work on the NPR model, where listeners are occasionally moved to donate to the show using the PayPal link in the upper right-hand corner of the desktop version of our website at paperbackwarrior.com. It helps cover the fixed costs of hosting the podcast and building up a reserve for new equipment. Every month or so, we like to recognize superfans who donate and make the show possible. So, Eric, who are we recognizing this week?
Yeah, this week we have Dennis Miller, David Kowalski, Well Stacked Books. I've been meaning to look into them. And Oliver Pink.
Good. Well, thank you, listeners. We really appreciate it. You are truly super fans. And even though it's not part of the deal, I still hope your donation leads to 3 inches of growth without supplements.
Nice.
You mentioned super fan Dennis Miller. It's not the comedian, but he is an author. And he was nice enough to send me a copy of one of his books. And I'm going to hand it over to you. It's called More Vintage Than Death. It's a hard-boiled murder mystery that takes place in the world of vintage paperbacks. People I know and trust have read it and tell me it's excellent. So thank you for the donation, Dennis, and thank you for the book. I may check it out sometime. Okay, so Eric, before we get into the feature, I want to run something by you. When you think of Johns Hopkins University, what do you think of?
Surgery in Baltimore.
Right, medical stuff in Baltimore. Johns Hopkins University, though, has also a press, and they sent me a book by a professor named Susanna Lee, who's actually a professor at Georgetown University, called Detectives in the Shadows, a Hard-Boiled History. It's a very academic, nonfiction hardcover book that's coming out. It's probably going to be out by the time this podcast airs, about the history of hard-boiled fiction. And it really tracks the characters. Race Williams was an early character by Carol John Daly that kind of spanned a lot of the 1940s and 50s, and sort of begins there. I'm kind of turning the pages. Then we get into Dashiell Hammett, specifically the Continental Op. And then, of course, it gets into Raymond Chandler and his Philip Marlowe character. Of course, we get into Mickey Spillane, Mike Hammer, and his Tiger Man. And then we get into more modern era, like the stuff that you're into, the Robert Parker Spencer series, and including the Spencer books published by other authors. I just arrived today, moments before you arrived at my house to record. It looks excellent. Again, it's called Detectives in the Shadows by Susanna Lee, and it's available on Amazon for those of you who are into nonfiction books about hard-boiled fiction. So, Eric, are you all geared up to do your big feature?
Indeed.
All right, then play the transition music so the listener knows what's coming.
Today I want to tell you about a mid-century paperback writer named Elmer Merle Parsons, better known as crime fiction author Philip Race. While he's somewhat obscure, Race authored a number of crime noir and western novels that I want to tell you about. Elmer Parsons was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1926, and at the age of 23, Parsons was convicted of grand theft auto. He stole a used car from a Phoenix auto dealership. He was arrested and convicted, and his conviction led to a 3-year stint in Chino State Prison. After his release, he continued his life of crime. In 1955, he was arrested in Pasadena, California, for passing 22 stolen checks. He explained to the court that he needed the cash to, quote, tide him over while awaiting money for a script he claimed he sold. At this time, he explained that he couldn't get a regular job due to his criminal record. After being convicted of check fraud, he was sentenced to 5 years at San Quentin Prison. Did you ever hear the Johnny Cash album, Live from San Quentin?
I love that album.
That's great. Surprisingly, this prison stint proves to be a catalyst for Parsons' pursuit to be an author and scriptwriter. While at San Quentin, Parsons became the editor of the prison newspaper, while also successfully selling his first novel. It was called Self-Made Widow, and he managed to sell it to Fawcett Gold Medal in 1959. Now, Tom, take a guess how much he got for Self-Made Widow in 1959.
And now, see, I thought the going rate for Fawcett Gold Medal books around that time was like $2,000 per book. I know that authors liked working for Fawcett because they paid more than the next tier of paperback houses like graphic books. Then again, the guys who ran Fawcett were pretty shrewd business people, and if they knew that Mr. Parsons was incarcerated, they also probably figured he wasn't in the greatest negotiating position. But I'm still going to stick with $2,000 as my guess.
$2,000, okay. It was $3,500.
Wow.
Yeah, think about that. He could get a ton of cigarettes and socks for that kind of cabbage in the pen.
Or maybe a hot boyfriend, if that was his thing. Or he could pay protection money to ensure that he wasn't anyone else's hot boyfriend.
Yes. I'm sure it was money well earned and well spent. While in prison, Parsons authored 2 novels starring a craps dealer named Johnny Berlin. Another Fawcett Gold Medal release in 1959 titled Killer Take All, and 1960's Johnny Come Deadly, which was published by Hillman Books, and it had 2 L's in Philip.
I've had Killer Take All on my to-read stack for about a year, and I kept passing it by for no good reason, and you beat me to the punch and actually read the book. How was it?
Yeah, here's my short review. The book introduced Johnny Berlin on a foggy back road in rural Oregon. Berlin is on his way to Portland to start a new life after his love life ruined him in Las Vegas. Berlin is a talented craps dealer, and he just wants a new start. And he becomes lost on the Midnight Highway and gets some roadside directions to this tiny lakeside community called McCainville. And it's there that Berlin gets some rest, and he runs into this former lover. Surprisingly, the whole community is ripe with gambling halls, and Berlin's services are needed. But once he goes to work for a struggling club, Berlin learns there's a syndicate racket of extortion called the Gamblers Protective Association. So Berlin helps the club defy the odds and fight back against the racket. I thought the story was good. It wasn't great, and it had a ton of characters. But it had violence, it had beautiful women, and it was par for the course for a mid-20th century crime noir. You could do a lot worse, I guess. But again, that was Killer Take All by Philip Race.
Yeah, I may give it a shot someday, but I have to wait till we build up this sizable backlog in our reviews for the blog, because right now I can't afford the time to read things that you've already read. I'm just counting on living longer than you.
Right, and I'm waiting for you to die so I can read Corey.
Be my guest.
But one page at a time, our archive continues to grow. But after his prison stint, Elmer Parsons continued to write. In 1960, he authored a suspenseful romance novel called Dark of Summer. It was published by Avon, and it was published under the name E.M. Parsons. I read most of the book, and I found it to be a complicated love story about a drifter who rolls into a lakeside community and finds himself drawn into a romance triangle and this bitter, boring real estate war. While the writing was fair, the amount of characters was overwhelming, and I just had to bail out.
Man, I totally understand what you're saying. I take notes as I read any book to assist me with the review that I'm going to have to write, and my notes always have a character list. And in a 180-page novel, there's no reason to have a cast of thousands. After all, this is not Game of Thrones we're talking about. There's no better way to ensure that I'm not going to finish a book than having too many characters. Now, in Stephen King's The Stand, that's fine. He's working with 1,000 pages. But an old Dell paperback doesn't need that kind of crowd.
I agree. Beginning in the early 1960s, Parsons had emerged as a scriptwriter for Hollywood. The list of television shows he scripted is pretty impressive. Let's look at it down the list here. Squad Car, The Aquanauts, Sea Hunt, Everglades, The Dakotas, The Virginia, Bonanza. Using the name of E.M. Parsons, the author also wrote 3 Western originals. The first was Texas Heller in 1959. I haven't read that one. The second was Fargo in 1968. And our good friend and supporter Lee Goldberg told me that he really liked it. Lee said about Fargo, and I quote, "A smart, lean, fast little Western, more of a novella than a novel. Turns out it has very little to do with the TV episode of the same name that Parsons wrote 10 years earlier, though I suppose it could be the story of Fargo the man 20 years after the events in the book. Both are studies of what it means to be a hero and the price a man pays to be one." The third Western proved to be the last novel Parsons authored. It was called The Easy Gun and was published in 1970, the year of his death. Now, I'm going to do a review of The Easy Gun in a few minutes at the end of this episode. But in closing out the feature, we want you to know that most of Parsons' body of work is available affordably now as ebooks. Cutting-edge books, owned and operated by Lee Goldberg and Joel Goldman, have released the following books already. Killer Take All, Johnny Come Deadly, Dark of Summer, Self-Made Widow, and they're in the process of releasing Texas Heller very soon. I want to thank the imdb.com site for information about the author. Also thanks to Lee Goldberg for providing some insight on Parsons, especially his life of crime. But that's all I have. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the authors that we have read and covered who have actually truly done time in prison and then written about that experience. I know Chester Himes, the author of the Gravedigger Jones series, is an African-American hard-boiled author. He actually did time in prison. I think he wrote one of his first books there. You read a book, I'm trying to find it here on the website. I'm frantically searching while we're talking here, by an author. It was who did time in prison, and his books took place there. Do you remember that one? It was I think Starkhouse reprinted them.
Oh, yeah. He wrote in the...
Felony Tank by Malcolm Braley.
He also did On the Yard, didn't he?
Yeah. So he was another prisoner. And then he had Milton Ozaki, who probably should have been in jail, but he wasn't.
And you have Dan Marlowe, who basically falls in love with the guy in prison and moves in with him.
Well, that's a whole different story. We're going to do an episode on Dan Marlowe in the future, and it's going to shock people, the Dan Marlowe story. Anyway, so that was a good feature, and overall, is he an author we should be checking out?
Yeah, definitely. I think he's got some talent. I just wish he didn't have so many characters in his books, but that's just something I'll have to overlook.
Okay. Well, I'm going to do a review now, if that's okay. It's the book's called Killer in White by Ted Thomey. Again, I wish I could pronounce his name better. It's Thomey. So it could be Tommy, but it could be Thomey. Not really sure myself. But his real name was Harold John Thomey. Ted, Tedd, was his nickname. He lived from 1920 to 2008, and he served as a U.S. Marine in the Pacific during World War II, and he was one of the guys who stormed Iwo Jima. He returned to the States to pursue a career as a journalist with the San Francisco Chronicle and the Long Beach Independent, with a specialty in restaurant reviews. He also wrote 20 books, including a 1956 Fawcett Gold Medal original titled Killer in White. I'm going to hand this over to you. Here, I can just toss it to you. There you go. It's about this guy, Dr. Douglas Webb, who's a total fraud. He pretends to be a chiropractor healing female patients with dubious therapy, such as his fancy magnotherapy machine. But Eric, I'm here to break it to you gently. It's all a scam. He doesn't even have a degree in medicine, not even one in chiropractic stuff. He just makes it up as he goes along. Why would someone do this, Eric? 2 reasons. 1, for the money. And 2, to have unlimited sex with his unlimited cadre of adoring female patients. So our protagonist for this book is a bit of a heel, and you need to be comfortable with that to enjoy the book at all. Anyway, his fun is interrupted by an investigator from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Federal Security Agency. I don't even know if that agency exists, who figures out that Dr. Webb is a non-credentialed con man. The investigator also has reason to believe that his magnotherapy machine, forming the centerpiece of his practice, is just a bunch of hokum. But the only way the fake doctor can get rid of this pesky federal investigator is to bribe him $15,000.
That'll do it.
So the book's only like 144 pages, and the bulk of it is him trying to get this money. And the way he's trying to get money to bribe the federal agent is by bedding down rich ladies and then shaking them down for money while they're still in this orgasmic haze, because he's really good between the sheets. He's a wizard between the sheets. There's a lot of subplots that the author juggles. Some are more interesting than others. As Dr. Webb is forced to put out fire after fire to keep his scam afloat, the novel becomes this frantic read with some great moments sprinkled throughout. You ever see that last scene in Goodfellas where where Ray Liotta is running around. He's trying to make pasta. He's picking up kids. He's delivering cocaine. He's hiding from the FBI surveillance helicopter floating above him at all times.
It's multitasking.
Yeah, a lot of the book reminded me of that. It was great. I liked it a lot. The final act, Getting Away with Murder storyline, was just really excellent and totally worth the wait, as was the resolution to the romance that develops through the novel. So despite some minor reservations, I really liked this book, Killer in White. It's also got an awesome cover for those of you who are art people. There's some pretty nifty plot twists toward the end and some incredibly genuinely tense moments involving medical stuff when he's being called upon to actually practice medicine and like lives are in the balance. Ted Thomey's writing is serviceable, and all the plot threads are very neatly resolved at the end. Unfortunately, it's not available as a reprint or an ebook yet, so you got to find a used copy online. I wouldn't move heaven and earth to acquire a copy, but if you can snag one cheaply, it's definitely worth your time. The book, again, is Killer in White by Ted Thomey. And again, Ted is T-E-D-D, and Thomey is T-H-O-M-E-Y. I also reviewed it at paperbackwarrior.com if you want to check that out.
Would you read any of his other 19 books?
Yeah, I got a bunch. And
Okay.
He did some aviation books that look kind of interesting and with sort of an international flair. I also have a book involving a guy. The opening scene, I read the first couple pages because it looked interesting. I can't remember the name of it. But a guy is basically running around handcuffed to a slot machine that he stole. And so it's sort of like, how did he get here? What's he going to do with the slot machine that he's now handcuffed to as he's running around like a fire escape with it?
That sounds like a lot of fun.
No, he's good. He's a solid guy. But you can just tell that like writing novels was not something that he took seriously. Like the restaurant reviews was his real passion.
Gotcha.
All right, so you got a review to do also.
Yeah, definitely. So, as promised earlier, I'm reviewing The Easy Gun by Elmer Merle Parsons. It was published in 1970 by Fawcett Gold Medal. The book's beginning finds this character named Little Easy in an El Paso jail, cheating his fellow cellmates out of money, guitars, and pride. After a few days of debauchery, Easy finds himself headed to a long-term prison sentence. However, his father, a guy named Big John Easy, pleads with the judge to allow his son one more opportunity to find righteousness. That opportunity is a large herd of Mexican cattle that John has found and agreed to sell to Long Gone McGoffin, a cattle dealer. And John and the judge agree that Little Easy's rightful place is on the range, roping cattle instead of liquor and cards. So Little Easy departs jail and heads to the range to count cows. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Unfortunately, Big John makes many of the same mistakes that his son does. So after McGoffin finds that the cattle are covered in ticks, he refuses to purchase them. So Big John, in this drunken rage, confronts the cattle dealer and demands his money. But McGoffin, being sensible, attempts to talk Big John off the ledge. A fight ensues, and McGoffin is forced to fatally shoot Big John. So when word reaches back to Little Easy, he sets out to avenge his father's murder, despite the misinformation that it was just a cold-blooded slaying. Parsons utilizes many of the same elements that made his crime fiction engaging. There's gambling scenes, there's flawed heroes and villains, and there's a number of characters that serve as a backdrop for his protagonist to interact with. Once the action moved to a dusty town, I think it was called Ellsworth, the reader gets thrust into sort of an emotional conflict. Is Easy justified in his quest for vengeance, or is McGoffin this cool-headed businessman that made a tough but right choice? I think both characters represent the late 1800s. Easy is probably the more primitive, unsettled frontiersman, and McGoffin really the embodiment of the progressive modern West. Despite where your allegiance really lies, The Easy Gun is a fantastic story. Sadly, it was published the year of Parsons' death. With just a trio of Westerns notched on his gun, I imagine that Parsons could have delivered a lot of quality stories, given enough time. But nevertheless, The Easy Gun is a testament to his talent, and I really enjoyed it.
All right, so that wraps up this episode of Paperback Warrior Podcast. Please follow us on Facebook to see the covers of these books we discuss and dive into our vast archive of reviews and articles at paperbackwarrior.com. On behalf of my broadcast partner, Eric, this is Tom saying that we will talk to you next Monday.